Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Today I'm showing you how to make a skirt with an elastic back waistband. This is so easy to do. You don't need a pattern because all of the pieces are rectangles. All you need is a few measurements. And to prove that, the skirt that I'm making in this video is being made for a friend with only the measurements that she sent me. For this, you'll need 3 measurements. The first is your waist measurement. This is where the waistband is going to sit. Today I'm working with a measurement of 30 inches. The second measurement is the length of the skirt. So measure from your waist down to wherever you want it to end. In my case, I'm working with 21 inches. And the last is a hip measurement because that is the largest point that the waistband is going to have to fit over. And the measurement I have written down is 41 inches. In addition to those 3 measurements, you also need to know how much seam allowance you're going to use, and I am using 1/2 inch here. Once you have your measurements and your seam allowance figured out, you can now start determining the sizes of the pieces that you're cutting. You're going to have 3 different pieces you need to cut. Your front waistband, which is a long skinny rectangle, your back waistband, which is a longer skinny rectangle, and your skirt pieces. You'll cut 2, but they'll be the same size, and these can be anywhere from a square to a rectangle depending on what length and width you end up deciding on. We are going to start by figuring out the front waistband. So for the shorter side of the rectangle, I'm considering that the height. To determine this, you want to decide how tall do you want your waistband. I'm going with 1 inch, and then you need to add seam allowance to it. So for me, that's 1/2 inch. So 1 inch plus 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches. And then take that number and double it, which for me is 3 inches, and that is the height that I want for this waistband. Next is the length of the front waistband. For this, you're going to start by taking your waist measurement and dividing it in half. So I'm working with a 30-inch measurement, and half of that is 15. To the number 15, I'm going to add double my seam allowance. And that just means take my seam allowance, multiply it by 2, which gives me 1 inch. So 15 plus 1 equals 16 inches. That is the length for my front waistband. Onto the back waistband. Now this starts out really easy because the height of the back waistband is the same as the front, so in my case 3 inches. The length is a little more complicated. You're going to start by taking half of your waist measurement, so again 15 inches in my case, and multiplying it by 1.5 or 1.5 if you're using a calculator. For me, that comes out to 22.5 inches. From there, you want to add double your seam allowance, again for me 1 inch, and that gives me a total of 23.5 inches. At this point, you're going to stop and check to see if your waistband, once it's sewn, will fit over your hips. To do that, you're going to add together the lengths of the front and back waistbands and then subtract out all added seam allowance. If you've lost track of how much seam allowance has been added, it's your desired seam allowance times 4. So in my case, all of that equation would come out to be 16 plus 23.5 equals 39.5 minus 2 inches, giving me 37.5 inches. And that would be the finished waistband once it's sewn. Now I'm going to take that measurement and compare it to the hip measurement. If your finished waistband measurement is larger than your hip measurement, then you don't need to make any changes. You can go right ahead to the next part. However, if your hip measurement is larger than your finished waistband measurement, you are going to need to increase the waistband by adding length to the back waistband piece. To figure out how much you need to add, you take your hip measurement and subtract the waistband measurement from it. So in my case, 41.5 inches minus 37.5 inches is 4 inches. That is the minimum amount that I need to add to my back waistband. And actually, you may want to even add 1/2 inch to 1 inch extra to that number just to have a little more room, make it a little easier to get on. So in my case, the original length for my back waistband was 23.5 inches. Adding 4 inches to that would give me 27.5. I'm going to go ahead and add 1/2 inch of ease and round that up to a 28-inch length. One last piece, thankfully it is pretty easy, and that is the skirt pieces. Now you're going to cut 2 of these. They will be the same size though, and we're going to start by talking about the width. Now this is a little bit more variable because it depends on how full you want your skirt gathered. The narrowest your width can be is the length of your back waistband, and that would be for a lightly gathered skirt. If you want it more gathered, then you can take the width of your front waistband and double it. And that's what I'm going to do here. So 16 times 2 is 32. Next is the length. For that, you're going to take your desired length, then add the seam allowance for the top edge, and then add however much you want to turn up your hem. So in my case, a 21-inch skirt, that would be the length, plus half an inch for the top seam allowance, gives me 21.5 inches. And then a 1-inch hem would give me 22.5 inches total for my length. And now you know how to get to all of the measurements that you need for these pieces. I know it was a lot of numbers and a lot of math, but I did put up the formulas on the screen if you need to go back and look at them. Hopefully that will help. Now you can go ahead and cut out your pieces using the measurements that you just figured up. Just for review, you should have one front and one back waistband and 2 skirt panels. Now take both of the waistband pieces to the ironing board and fold the short ends in half, lining up the edges of the long sides, and press it. When you unfold the pieces, you should have a crease down the center. Now fold up one of the long edges to the wrong side, the amount of your seam allowance. So in my case, half an inch, and press in place. Now you should have 2 creases on both waistband pieces, and you want to unfold them so that they're laying flat. So the front and back waistband pieces together along the 2 short ends, making sure that the right sides of the fabric are together and that the creases line up. Now set that aside and move on to the skirt pieces. Go ahead and sew those 2 pieces together along one side seam. Now go ahead and finish that seam using whatever kind of seam finish you want. I'm just serging the edge. Decide which end you want to be the bottom of the skirt. Fold that edge up to the wrong side using half of your planned hem and press it in place. Now fold it up the same amount and press it again. Next, sew the other side seam, making sure to unfold the hem so that you're only sewing through 2 layers. Then finish that seam as well. You can either hem the skirt now or wait until the end. Since I was hemming this by hand, I decided to wait, but if I was doing it by machine, I would go ahead and do it at this point while it's still mostly flat. Now it's time to gather the top of the skirt to the sides of the waistband. I do have a more detailed tutorial on how to gather fabric, which I will link in the description if that will help. Start by running 2 rows of gathering threads along the top of the skirt. And the goal in this next step is to pin the top edge of the skirt to the long edge of the waistband that does not have a crease. And the first 2 places that you're going to pin these pieces together is at the side seam. So you want to line up one side seam of the skirt with a side seam of the waistband, pin it there, and then do the same on the other side. Then pull on the gathering threads to tighten the skirt to the size of the waistband. Even out those gathers and pin in place along the long raw edge of the waistband. Then you can sew those 2 pieces together. You should only be going through the skirt and 1 layer of the waistband. At this point, it's always a good idea to make sure that you didn't catch any other part of the waistband in the skirt before pulling out your gathering threads. Now fold the back waistband down along that center crease and pin it in place with the raw edges tucked up along the smaller crease. Now sew it in place going from one side seam to the other, and you want these stitches to be as far away from the top edge as possible while still catching the bottom edge. And this is creating the casing for your elastic. Speaking of elastic, you need a piece that is slightly narrower than the height of your waistband. And for the length, you want half your waist measurement plus half an inch. Now thread the elastic into the back waistband. I use a safety pin. And then pin one end in place, leaving a 1/4 inch extending out past the side seam. Then pull the other end out a 1/4 inch past the other seam and pin it in place as well. And go ahead and pin the front waistband the same as you did with the back. Then stitch over one side seam to secure the elastic in place. I like to start at the top of the waistband, sew down, then back stitch to where I started, and then stitch down again just to make sure it's secure. Once you're back down at the bottom of the waistband, you can turn the skirt and sew the front waistband down. When you reach the other side seam, turn again and stitch over that last side seam to secure the other end of the elastic. And you may have to even out the fabric along the elastic after sewing. Sew the hem if you haven't already, and you're done. Now let's see if this one fits. It did fit. I was actually worried that it might not, even though I have done this before and it's always worked out. I do find that sometimes when I turn on the camera, I suddenly have all of these problems that I've never had happen. But thankfully that wasn't the case this time. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I hope you will join me next time for another handmade happening.